Welcome back, Psychology. So we are going to keep going with our study of the biological basis of behavior. And now we are moving into the actual parts of the brain and how do we know that these parts exist? And if people want to know something more about your brain, what are those ways that we can get pictures of the brain? So this unit for biological basis of behavior, what it will look like on your AP exam, about 8 to 10% of your questions will actually be from this unit. So this is a pretty significant chunk of content. We've already talked about the nervous system and the neuron and neural firing. We've talked about the endocrine system. But now in this particular video, we are going to be looking at parts of the structure of the brain as well as the tools for examining the brain. So here we go. So when we are looking at the brain, there's a number of different ways that we can do this. One of the first ways that we're going to look at is what's called a brain lesion. And a lesion is really just a way that you can take a tissue sample and look at it under a microscope to find possibly a tumor or an abnormality. And so it experimentally destroys the brain tissue so that you can study the behaviors after destruction. And again, that could come from something like cancer. It could come from a brain injury. Usually these lesions, when they're done, it's for a scientific or medicinal purpose. This obviously isn't something that you would elect to do for no reason. The next thing that we can use to understand what's going on in the brain is what's called an electroencephalogram. An electroencephalogram. We narrow this down, we make it much easier, and we're going to call it an EEG, okay? And this is a type of brain scan that'll show us brain waves. And you can see in this image here, there's all kinds of sensors that are put on the scalp. And this is an immediate, fast way to get a recording of brain waves. You know, before, if somebody is having an issue, this is a quick, easy way to get some feedback and data, because some of the other types of brain scans might take a little more time and effort, and sometimes that's not a possibility. The next type of brain scan is what we call a CT scan or a CAT scan, and it's short for computerized tomography. And with all of these, the actual names of these are not going to be something that you need to be able to recall, but it's more important to know what their abbreviated title is. So we're going to call this a CT scan or a CAT scan. And really, this is a cross-section of the brain. And what the machine will do is it will take multiple X-ray pictures. And you can see in this image here, it'll take a series of two-dimensional pictures. And these are really like slices or cuts of the brain. And again, I'm giving you all kinds of clues here to help you remember what a CT scan is. So a CT scan starts with a C. It is a cross-section of the brain, or a cut or slice of the brain. And a CT scan, 2 letters in CT scan, is a two-dimensional picture. A CT scan only shows us the structure of the brain. It only shows us the structure of the brain. It won't show us the function or the functioning of the brain. Next is what we call an MRI, and an MRI is known as a magnetic resonance image. And an MRI is a 3D computerized image. MRI, 3 letters. An MRI is a 3D image. So it allows the medical professionals to be able to distinguish the different types of brain tissue, to see healthy versus not healthy brain tissue. And these are super useful to identify the location of, say, a tumor, or the location and intensity of stroke damage. This will show structure, but not function. Okay, so both a CT scan and an MRI will not show us brain function. So you can see the comparison and why doctors will sometimes choose an MRI over a CT scan. Okay, the CT scan, if you're looking for specific types of feedback, a CT scan might be highly effective. But many times the doctors need to see the density, how big something is. And in that case, that's where an MRI would be much more appropriate. So another type of brain scan is what we call a PET scan, a positron emission tomography. Again, we are going to call it a PET scan. So a PET scan allows doctors to see the metabolic processes in the brain. And a person who is having a PET scan, they will ingest, they're going to drink, a radioactive form of glucose. And glucose is a type of sugar. And what that glucose will do is it creates this image that you can see here. And you can see where that glucose goes. And it has a lot to do with the metabolizing of that glucose. And so the PET scan then takes a picture of how the brain and how the body is using that glucose. So for me, the way I remember a PET scan, PET scans again involve the radioactive glucose. Well, do you remember, have you ever had or seen Pez candy? Pez, P-E-Z, looks a lot like PET scan. Pez candy is made of sugar. So Pez candy and sugar, PET scan, it's a radioactive form of glucose. It lets you see the activity and what's being done, where it's going, how the brain is using the glucose. The next type of brain scan is a functional MRI, And this is actually a combination of a PET scan and an MRI. So this will show us function and structure. Everything else so far has just been structure. But an fMRI will show you the functioning of the brain. How is it working? And so it actually gives us an image of blood flow that's tied with certain cognitive tasks. So in this case, they've had, just like a PET scan, they've ingested that glucose solution, but they are also at the same time taking an image of the brain, a 3D image. And so that glucose, while the person is awake, they will be asked maybe some questions or be asked to possibly solve some problems. And as they do that, the doctors can then see where certain parts of the brain are being utilized, so they can see the function of the brain. So now that we've got the structure of the brain, now that we have some of the ways that we can see the structures of the brain, it's time to get into the structures of the brain. And there's going to be a lot of these. And so I hope in your notes as I go through these that you're not only writing down the job, what these different parts of the brain do, but I'm going to give you, you know me, I'm going to give you some kind of silly mnemonics and some ways to help you remember these parts of the brain. And I'm telling you, there are so many of them in this unit that you're going to be very thankful at the end of this unit for some of the ways I'm going to give you to remember the parts of the brain. So we're going to start with the brainstem. And the brainstem is really the most primitive part of the brain. It's the old brain. And the reason they call it that is because as researchers were learning about the brain, before we had the amount of technology that we do today, this was really the first part of the brain that they could find and see and identify. And so that's why it's sometimes called the most primitive. We're not talking about dinosaurs and cavemen and that kind of thing. It is the part of the brain, it's at the base of the brain, and it's connected to the spinal cord. So we're going to take a little trip here, starting at the spinal cord. And after the spinal cord, this is what we would consider the brainstem. And so I'm going to take you through the different parts of the brainstem and their functions. So the first part is what we call the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. And it's at the top of the spinal cord. It's kind of this transitional spot. The medulla is responsible for all of your life-sustaining functions. So think of all the things that have to happen to your body in order for you to stay alive. Okay, you have to breathe. Your lungs have to work. Your heart has to beat. Your digestive system has to flow. Okay, all of these things are controlled by the medulla. If you sustain some type of horrible injury and the top of your spinal cord or the base of your brainstem is damaged, it will likely result in death because you can't survive if you can't breathe, your heart doesn't pump. You get what I'm saying? So an easy way to remember the medulla. Medulla looks a lot like a medal. You see the medal here. And when you are given a medal, da, 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 you've been awarded a medal. The medal rests right on top of your heart. The medal rests right on top of your heart. The medulla helps to control your heart rate and your heartbeat. A life-sustaining function. The next part of the brainstem is what we call the reticular formation. The reticular formation. And it is actually a network of nerves that carries messages between parts of the brainstem. And you can see this picture here. You've got the reticular formation, this network of nerves, and off it goes. These messages go out to different parts of the brain and the brainstem. The function of the reticular formation is that it has a role in states of consciousness and sleep and alertness, okay? Kind of like keeping you on top of things, the reticular formation. So a way to remember the reticular formation, okay, in the word reticular, I don't know, I hear the word tickle, reticular formation. And what happens when somebody tickles you, you become alert. And alertness is one of the roles that the reticular formation has, is to keep you in a state of alertness. The next part of the brainstem is the pons. And the pons and the reticular formation are very similar. Okay, the pons actually includes part of the reticular formation. And it's just an extension of those responsibilities. And the pons, however, where the reticular formation, tickle, tickle, alert, oh my God, alert, I'm awake, alertness. The pons, however, while it does have a connection to arousal, it is also, more importantly, responsible for calming arousal. So this picture here, I'm going to go in my nice meditative voice here. And you have a picture of a pond. And when you see a pond or you sit by a pond, don't you feel calm? That's the job of the pons. The next part of the brainstem is the cerebellum. You guys have heard about the cerebellum before, right? Okay, with your memory unit, possibly. So the cerebellum, or the little brain, is another nickname it's given. The cerebellum coordinates motor function, integrating motion and position, and it takes information from the inner ear and muscles, and the cerebellum helps to maintain balance. And one of those other functions, things like walking, tying your shoe, those types of memories that you don't have to think about. Okay, so an easy way to remember the cerebellum. Sarah was the belle of the ball when she walked in. Well, a key here, another function of the cerebellum that we're adding to, is that it has something to do with balance. So here is Sarah, who's a gymnast, on the balance beam. And in order for her to stay balanced on the balance beam, she wears a little bell around her neck. Sarah the bell wears a bell on the balance beam. Sorry guys, that's all I got. And finally, the last structure of the brainstem that we're going to talk about is the thalamus. The thalamus, and you can see it at the top of the brainstem. And so any type of message that those sensory neurons are sending through the spinal cord, they're going to pass through the thalamus. And you can think of it like it's a relay station, okay? So a message comes in and now it has to go somewhere. It's got to go somewhere. It's got to go to the place that processes sound, the place that processes vision, touch, all of these things, okay? It's the sensory relay station. And so all of that information that our senses take in, all of that information is received and routed to the brain thanks to the thalamus, okay? So I'd like to introduce you to Hal and Amos. You're going to see them again in another video. But let's think of Hal and Amos as traffic cops, okay? Hal and Amos. Look at the word thalamus. Thalamus, Hal and Amos. Hal and Amos are our traffic cops. Whoa, here comes a hot finger. Get it off the stove. Okay, let's go this way. You're going to the parietal lobe. Ooh, here comes a really big blast from the radio. All right, you are going to the temporal lobe. They are the traffic cops, Hal and Amos, the thalamus, the relay station of the brain. Okay, there we go. The screen is black. We must be done. So we'll pick this up in the next video.